Well, hello, and welcome to What the Trans.
What the Trans?
Yes, What the Trans, and the title gives you everything you need to know. This is a podcast for the trans community, and it's made by trans people too, so isn't that novel? Welcome to the show, I'm Ashley.
And I'm Michelle, and this was a particularly good week for the pod. We did a live episode.
Woo! We sure did, yes. So we were invited to do a little workshop about how to do a podcast. So we recorded an entire section of the show doing this workshop and explaining to people how they too can do a podcast. So lots of useful information is in there, as well as the jolly little Google Docs PowerPoint presentation that we did will be made available online with the release of this episode. So yeah, you see, look how helpful we're being, Michelle.
Yeah, like last time we talked about how the LGBT media is suffering right now. I'd like to think we're doing our bit to try and turn the tide.
Yes.
And it's a shocking state of affairs when we get to say that we are the biggest trans UK news podcast because we're the only one. And I don't want to be the only one. There's a lot of pressure.
There is, yeah. And also, it's like, admittedly, that is a bit niche, isn't it? A UK-based trans news podcast. You've got to admit that is very specific. But I was not expecting us to be the only ones. That is really weird for me. So, I guess...
I mean, there might be another one out there that I've not heard of, but I've looked at all the major things, and appear to be the only one.
Nice. Well, that's doing newsy stuff about trans things specifically in the UK. Yes. So
yes,
let's quantify it with that. And if there's somebody else doing that, great, cool. Let's link in. Well, we'll swap tips. But since we are currently, as far as we know, the only trans newsy podcast of its kind in the UK, which makes us the biggest, of course, blah blah blah, and so on. Yeah, I'm not really bothered about that, to be honest. It's not really much of a cachet. Well, we're the only one, but we're so niche, you kind of aren't surprised. But to prove that we are worthy of this mantle, this responsibility, I guess we'd better do the news. To start with, 2 weeks ago, in the last episode, we talked about how there was, allegedly, a bunch of trans-excluding radical feministy Terf types going all the way to America to meet with the far right and have meetings. Allegedly, this was allegedly taking place, and we were very, very clear that it was allegedly. But it turned out it was all completely true. Posey Parker, Dr. Julia Long, and Venice Allen, infamous transphobes all, and the kind of people you just know cheat at Monopoly, did actually make the trip to Washington, D.C. to plot alongside the Heritage Foundation, which is an American right-wing think tank that is famous for believing that women should have no bodily autonomy whatsoever and that being gay is morally wrong. So in brief, the full Terf-based twattery on tour included linking up with the far-right affiliated Hands Across the Aisle group and bellowing nonsense outside of the headquarters of various social media companies. But the absolute headline act of the tour was when Posey Parker and Julia Long uploaded a video of themselves harassing Sarah McBride, who is the International Press Secretary for the Human Rights Campaign and is herself a trans woman. In the video, they burst into the room where McBride's simply working on a laptop alongside a photographer. They begin to misgender Bride and ask her all sorts of loaded questions about how she is working to open the doors for sex offenders to have access to women and girls, and other such things clearly designed to get a reaction from McBride on the video. But McBride, to her credit, gave them nothing. She ignored the abuse, and this video has actually sparked condemnation from all over, which, honestly, you'd really kind of hope it would, including from Chelsea Clinton, the daughter, of course, of Bill and Hillary, Natasha Lyonne, the actor famous for Orange is the New Black, and Ruth Hunt of Stonewall, alongside many, many others. Interestingly, earlier on in the day, McBride had been part of a meeting between members of Congress and the parents of trans kids where they had discussed a new version of the Equality Act that would ban discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So Posey and her pride of pricks are actually against this legislation, in spite of the fact that the proposed legislation would actually seek to protect LGBT people and women from discrimination. Because everything they are about makes total sense, right? No inherent contradictions here whatsoever. So, what, if anything, should we take away from all of this?
The leaders of this particular movement are not very good at PR.
I mean, definitely, for true. Why would you do that? Like, look, we're literally going to go and harass somebody who's just getting on with their job and hope that that makes us look like the good guys?
Yeah, it was a real. When I watched it, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what I was watching for a number of reasons. One, I couldn't believe how this happened the day after we recorded our last episode.
Yes.
I mean, it would have been nice if they'd done this stuff a day earlier. I mean, obviously, we should aim for them to never do this stuff ever. But if they're going to do it, at least do it to our timetable so we can upload an accurate podcast at the time of recording.
I'm not sure that's the main takeaway here, but no, carry on.
Well, okay. The main takeaway should be that I like these people that, like, if you break down what they're about, on the surface, it looks like that they are trying to make the world a better place, much like how many tyrants over time have done monstrous things to try and make the world a better place. Like, you could argue that Stalin, deep in his nightmarish brain, was just justifying murdering millions of people because he thought that he was genuinely making the world a better place.
I seriously doubt that he did think that. I'm pretty sure Uncle Joe knew exactly what he was doing, and he just didn't care about the morality of it. I think we're kind of out on a limb with that particular example. However...
Fair enough, but you see my overall point, that usually people do monstrous things with the best of intentions, whereas Posey Parker and Dr. Julia Long made it clear that they aren't doing these things with any kind of intention to make the world better. They're doing it because they enjoy bullying and harassing trans people.
Basically.
That appears to be their main motivating drive, because that's why they uploaded this video to Facebook themselves. Because they thought it was something to be proud of, and, you know, I'm pretty sure maybe on some level it gets them off in some way. Maybe not sexually, maybe just intellectually, but in some way they enjoy the fight more than working towards the end goal. Do you see what I mean?
I absolutely do, and I think I agree, to be honest. I think it comes back to that whole ethos that the cruelty is the point, because that's what they're in it for. But then also, it's like, the pair of them are describing themselves as feminists, as lesbian feminists in some cases. I can't remember which, yeah. Anyway, so they're describing themselves as feminists, but they are literally working alongside a group that says women shouldn't have any bodily autonomy, and, being gay is morally wrong. They're openly working alongside this group because they hate trans people so much. And it is just like they're obviously getting off on the hatred that they're able to stir up in themselves. And I am kind of terrified and fascinated as to why. Like, it's, but in a sense, the why of it is a moot point, because this is still happening, and this abuse is not a new thing, of course, because Long has long had a history of precisely this kind of thing, like prowling around a women's march, hoping that she could find Lily Madigan and verbally abuse her. And so open and brazen with it as well. And
she led that group of people that took over London Pride. She was at the front of that, and I think the only thing that we can take away from this is just another reason why, if you see a TERF on social media, block them immediately. If you see them out in the wild doing a protest, stand next to them and shout louder, Well, no, just don't...
These people... Don't get involved, ideally, in that sense. Wait for somebody else to... Because the problem is, they have demonstrated themselves to be quite keen on using violence and abuse in the past, and I don't think we should be encouraging people to open themselves up to that. But it's...
Good point.
But they...
Do what Ashley says, kids.
And basically, folks, these are far-right feminists. These people are kind of Nazi handmaidens, essentially, and that's, for whatever their motivations are, they're working with the far-right to deny women bodily autonomy, all women, and to say that being gay is morally wrong and you should go to prison for it, and so on. That's the sort of world that would be ushered in, were these people to take control, and that's what these people are working towards. They're not feminists, they're fucking Nazis, alright? So, anyway, enough of that, moving on. What's next?
Alright, well, let me take you back across the Atlantic and see what's going on in Scotland, where it has all gotten a little bit complicated.
Oh dear.
But back in September last year, the National Records of Scotland announced that there would be a non-binary option in the Scotland's next census, under the sex category. The aim of including this option was, of course, to find out how many non-binary people there actually are, which is a noble goal, because right now, in England and Wales, we're not going to have that question on the census. so we are not going to know how many non-binary people there are. This most positive move has now come under scrutiny as Holyrood's Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee published a report arguing that the census must retain the current male-female binary sex question. The report went on to recommend that a wider consultation takes place and made the point of saying that there was a serious lack of consultation with a range of women's groups, which has led to legislation being published which is not fit for purpose. Obviously, we here at What the Trans want to see non-binary as an option on the census, because we have no idea how many trans folks there are in total, let alone non-binary folks. Currently, the non-binary people are invisible when it comes to legal recognition, and it is nigh on impossible for a government to budget, draw legislation, and generally govern if they have no fucking idea what the population actually looks like. And whilst, as it stands at the time of recording, the non-binary option is set to go ahead in Scotland, this report has caused the usual poop monsters to start circling. So now is the time to stand up and make sure the goblin-y nightmare people don't take away this much-needed step towards non-binary recognition. If you live in Scotland, now is the time to get in contact with your local MSP. If you don't know who that is, you can simply go to parliament.scot/MSP finder, and that will tell you who you need to contact. Also, as it stands right now in England and Wales, the next census is currently going ahead without a non-binary option. And this is just plain fucking wrong. So to the English and the Welsh, go to theyworkforyou.com and find your MP and tell them this is nonsense and balderdash. Let's get non-binary people recognised. Those links will be in the pod description. I am very worked up.
Yes! So I see. Okay, take a breath, honey. Although, in fairness, of all the things to get worked up about, this is pretty valid, right? Because
there's no legal recognition for non-binary people.
Yes,
in most of the UK right now. How is that not? How is that a thing?
Well, Jesus, do you want the full story of how it's a thing? It's just successive governments not really listening to the trans community for over many, many issues, and kind of being ignored when we said, well, look, there's this whole other thing as well where it's like not male and not female, and they've just stopped listening. So, it's incredibly frustrating, and as you say, it actually could have an impact on your actual service provisions, such as they will be cut into their, pared to the bone state as they already are, and no doubt to suffer further once Brexit takes place. Those organisations aren't going to be able to do anything at all if they don't even have a clue of the scale of the problem. So this is a stupid idea, but it's obviously the pushback against the non-binary inclusion in Scotland has specifically said, well, women's groups haven't been consulted, which suggests that somebody has been paying attention to what we would call the usual suspects and their rhetoric about women being in danger from transgender people. It's the same kind of thing again, and hopefully Holyrood in Scotland and generally will just say, no, we're not going to do that. There's no need for that. We've already studied it. Shut up, sit down. We're doing this. That would be great.
I mean, it's not all doom and gloom from Scotland. I've completely forgot to write this in the notes, it would appear, but Nicola Sturgeon has recently come out and said that trans women are no threat to women and no threat to her feminism. So there is support in Scotland from some pretty high up people, but I think there are rumblings of a new group in Scotland, a new Terf group that's coming out of the woodwork, and I have a feeling that they had a hand in this. I couldn't, at the time of recording, get any more information than that, but if this develops, I will hopefully be able to tell you more on the next episode.
But now I think we shall move on to some absolutely astounding news. This is absolutely shocking. This is the biggest story we've ever spoken of here. It's going to absolutely knock your socks off. You will literally not believe it. Are you ready? Are you ready, Michelle? Are you ready?
Hold on. Now I'm ready.
Okay, cool. So it turns out the press have been lying.
But isn't that illegal?
Well, interestingly, ostensibly, yes, except, anyway, let us do the story. So, over the last couple of years, there have been various reports, starting from one in the Daily Star, which triggers your alarm bells immediately, that child-murdering super bastard Ian Huntley is actually a trans woman and was seeking to transition and move to a women's prison. So this news came vomiting out of the Daily Star back in 2017 in January, and has obviously since then has been picked up by the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Times, of course, and many others. The reports varied from Huntley requesting women's clothes and makeup to that he wears a wig and is insisting on being called Nicola. Now, so this story has been going around for about 2 years, and it turns out, of course, that nobody had thought to ask Ian Huntley himself what was going on until now. So after 2 years, in tiny, tiny font, buried away on a page of the newspaper that was nowhere near the front, the Daily Star finally printed a clarification that states Ian Huntley would like to make it clear that he does not own a wig, has never asked to be addressed by any name other than his own, and there has never been a plan for him to change his gender identity. So, this story of Ian Huntley's transition has been used by many of the trans community's biggest enemies in the media as a reason to deny us rights and to paint trans people as weird, twisted killers who should be kept away from the cis population because we could be dangerous. This myth, this lie, was created by a media industry that values clicks over the truth, and you can see that in all of the coverage that this bullshit got. Not once did anybody seek to ask Huntley directly if any of it was true. The initial reports quote sources from the prison, which meant that anyone could have told a journalist this fantastical tale, and the journalist ran with it and chose not to see if it was true because bashing trans people makes them money in ad sales, as does sensationalism. They love that one too. So this, perfect storm, jam those two things together. So now 2 years later, this clarification has come in, but the damage has been done. The only thing to take away from this, always look critically at the anti-trans stories in the press. And if you're able, you point out the flaws or the lies if you can see them. You can go to the Independent Press Standards Organisation's website, which is ipso.co.uk, ipso, and make a complaint. The earlier the better. We can try and hold the media to account for their lies, but we have to do it as soon as we can. Obviously, more information about that website and about the process is included in our description. So, shocking stuff, except no it isn't, because they're doing this all the bloody time. But that whole thing, that Ian Huntley is trans, you guys are all twisted and dangerous, has been used as a stick to beat us with since January 2017. I've heard it repeated so many times, and it's not true, and the clarification is not getting anywhere near the same traction that the original story did, because of course it wouldn't. Yeah, I am very worked up.
And rightly so, because, no one asked Huntley what his thoughts were on this for 2 years. They just published the first thing that sounded nice because it would make them cash. That is, But we can totally take this as one of the many examples now of the outright press lies. So if anybody doesn't believe us when we say that the press is right now currently at war with the trans community, we now have something very, very high profile to point at and say,
well, there was this.
And this whole story was pretty fishy from the start.
It was.
I think I heard at one point that Ian Huntley wanted to be referred to as Lena, and at one point as Jessica, there's been several names going around that have changed.
I see.
And varying different reports that are quite contradictory over the years. At one point he was supposedly getting foundation from the prison shop, and then at one point he was actually talking to a governor about, getting a case conference to change his legal sex and stuff. There's just been all these different reports coming through that just haven't added up. But they just ran with it because, it's that wonderful cross-section between anything with Ian Huntley in it and anything with trans people in it gets people angry.
Yep.
And this was the holy fucking nexus of nonsense just coming together.
Yeah.
It's no wonder that we have, the UK has the lowest trust in its press in Europe. It's stuff like this.
Yeah, basically. Although I'm sure some people do trust it, although God knows who they are. Anyway, so not surprising, kind of sickening that they would do that, but then, yeah. Moving on, I think, to lighter news, to our jolly little gender pop culture disorder fun times.
Okay, and yes, let's do some pop culture disordering gender nonsense before we get to the live show. The American network, the CW, has actually ordered a pilot for a show called Glamorous, which will be, if taken to full series, the first American show to ever feature a non-binary lead character.
Woo!
Details are thin on the ground. It has been developed by Jordan Nardino, who was most famous for working on Desperate Housewives, and the only plot details that are available right now at the time of recording are that it will focus on a non-binary person who gets a dream job at a cosmetics company that they slated on YouTube. Which, yeah, I've literally known people do that. Non-binary people have been making that very same, have been complaining about cosmetic companies for years. So, yeah, I mean, that feels like a real premise to me. But if this show is brought to a series, it will join up with the rest of the CW's queer-tastic content, including Supergirl, which has the first trans woman superhero in it. It's got Riverdale, Charmed, and Black Lightning. It's just so queer right now. The CW are nailing it, and I will be here with more details as they emerge.
All right, sounds cool. I have enjoyed some of the other CW stuff, and obviously I've heard you talk quite a lot about Supergirl. But yeah, cool. Looking forward to that. And finally, and astonishingly and shockingly, I'm doing a bit in the gender pop culture disorder because I more or less insisted and wrestled the notes off Michelle because it's about Janelle Monae, who I love. Janelle Monae, the singer, pansexual, openly queer, thoroughly awesome, dedicated her nominations at the Grammy Awards to her trans brothers and sisters, and it was so goddamn lovely I might even cry. So, talking to Variety, she was asked about her coming out as a queer woman of colour, so the actress and singer and goddamn hero said that she dedicates the nomination to trans people who live their truth openly and are punished for it, saying, "My trans brothers and sisters, they do it every day and they are shunned from these sorts of events, so this one is for them." So that was amazing to read about, such support. It was just, everything she does is amazing. But
it's so lovely to hear you fangirling for once. It's usually me.
I know, right? Well, it's Janelle Monae. How can you not? But unfortunately, she didn't win. She didn't win in any of the nominated categories. But you should absolutely check out her last album, Dirty Computer, because it bangs and it's great, and she's an awesome ally. And actually, the preceding album, Electric Ladies, is just awesome. There's a collaboration with Solange on there. It's just, yeah, it's awesome. So I saw her on tour in September last year, and I'm seeing her again in July when she's in Manchester again. I'm just fangirling so hard over this whole thing. It's gonna, yeah. Okay, I should calm down now, shouldn't I? Whew, okay.
That was lovely to hear.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
And now I have a recommendation, because I actually haven't listened to any Janelle Monae. I mean, I've only ever known her from the acting, from Hidden Figures and stuff like that, which she was really good in. So I will be downloading those albums tonight.
Do the thing.
I will do the thing. So now, is that all the news, Ash? I think that's all the news,
That is all of the news, because, of course, this episode is a special episode. Because we went out into the world and did a thing live, didn't we?
Yeah, our first ever live show.
Yes.
It was really, really cool. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was a good experience. And so, to set the scene, we were both at a regular trans event up here in Manchester. It's organised by the LGBT Foundation, and so we agreed to do a workshop about how to start up your own podcast. So details about that are obviously in the segment that's about to follow, as well as the presentation that we did, which is going to be made available alongside this episode. So it's good for some hints, pointers, and it's got some absolutely classic snark in it as well. So yeah, here it is. Enjoy.
Hello, welcome to What the Trans Live!
So welcome to this jolly little session at the LGBT Foundation in Manchester, and it's all about how to make your own podcast. But we're also making an episode of said podcast while we're about it. You see, we're multitasking. That's how good we are. So yes, welcome aboard. Thank you for joining us. We'll go through more or less everything you might conceivably need, starting with, what is a podcast?
I'm sure most of you will know this, but some of you may not. Basically, they are radio shows you can listen to anytime you want. You can download them to pretty much anything with an internet connection. I've seen people play podcasts through all sorts of things, including fridges and everything. Basically, the term comes from a combination of iPod, where they basically exploded from, and broadcast. So you are broadcasting to an iPod, but not really anymore because iPods died. They've exploded in the last 10 years. Something like 60% of all people between like 15 and 35 listen to a podcast. Yeah, they are everywhere. They are taking over commutes. They are taking over people's ears all the time. And there's hundreds of different genres of podcasts. You could make pretty much anything you want. There's fictional ones like Night Vale. There's probably one out there about coin collecting that no one will listen to, because why? There's just, name a subject, name a kind of person, name a genre, that podcast exists somewhere.
So why should you specifically do it? So as we've mentioned, they're more or less ubiquitous things now. There are so many different types of podcasts for different types of things. But the point is this relates to, in a sense, the age we're living in. This is the information age. And one of the big powers of the internet is the fact that it has allowed communities like the trans community and like other communities to actually talk to each other, communicate and work together in a way that just wasn't possible before. This democratization of communication and of information is the power of our age. And I think by encouraging people to kind of have their own voice and be able to express their own opinions or artistic efforts or whatever, we should be doing that, right? And we should be encouraging those things and helping each other to do so. So that's kind of, that was our impetus for, like, you know, this is not a competition. We're not, you know, if you want to do a trans news podcast, great, cool, we'll give you some pointers. But, you know, let's all...
let's get our voices out there because, for the people at home, I'm about to show them a slide. You can download this slide from our website, whatthetranspod.tumblr.com. In this live one, you're going to hear exactly how many times I stumble over my mouth.
Yeah, you are.
Okay.
Which is why we shouldn't, you know, this is kind of a meta conversation we're having now. This is the sort of thing that would go in the edit, you know? So, but one of the other reasons that you should do a podcast is because there's a certain amount of market saturation, essentially. Next one, I think.
Yeah, this is what podcasting looks like today.
I mean, yeah, I'm spotting a theme.
Yeah, we've got Mark Maron from WTF. Richard Herring does one. David Tennant does one. Joe Rogan, who is one of the worst people in the world, he has one. David Walliams, Ed Miliband, Brian Cox, Peter Crouch. Even Ron Burgundy has a podcast, and he isn't even real. Okay? Like, there's no one like us is doing this, like, really in the UK. Like, there's From the Vaults by Morgan Page. That's a history podcast about trans people, which you should check out. There's Transtopia by Fox, Fisher, and all of the people at my generation. But that's it. And we need more. Because, you know, we're being drowned out by everyone in the media.
But it's about traditional media versus new media as well, isn't it? Because, like, traditional media can chase its tail and scream about trans people and, you know, the people that they call immigrants and so on, and it can do that as long as it likes, because actually quite a lot of people aren't even listening to that anymore. So, and this is about kind of developing how things are done in the future, in that sense, because if we're using the internet to create and distribute content, what's even the point of the Daily Mail? Which honestly has been a valid question since before the internet, but
the thing is, your podcast doesn't have to necessarily be about trans stuff. The fact that you are a trans person talking about the subject of your choice is already more than enough. Like, there are so many video game podcasts. There are thousands of them. And I've never heard a trans person on one. I think Carolyn Petit in America does one with Feminist Frequency, but that's more like the Anita Sarkeesian show. I mean, I didn't want to throw shade at Anita Sarkeesian.
No, you don't want to do that.
Like, you know, it's not exactly any trans-led video game podcasts out there. So if that's your thing, or wrestling, or glass blowing, bell ringing, like, whatever. If there's I can guarantee there are no trans voices in the bell ringing community. And I think that we should maybe fill the gap.
Absolutely. But then there's also things like certain types of podcasts that have exploded about things that people would have been ashamed to buy books on before, but now it's okay.
There's so many murder podcasts. So many.
And it's like, if you were sat on a bus before reading a book, Great Murders of History, you know, you quite rightly might get a few, you know, looks askance from your fellow commuters, but now you can listen to it on a podcast, so apparently it's perfectly okay.
This goes against the spirit of what we're trying to say here, but don't do a true crime podcast. There's too many already. There's just too many.
Anyway, I think we should move this because I'm sick of these, you know, people staring at me.
Go away, hairy/baldy men.
All right. So, as a basic start,
yes, there are a few things you need to do if you want to start podcasting. You need a brief. You need 1 or 2 sheets of A4 that outlines every part of your potential podcast, like what the different sections will be, how many people you'll need to be involved, what kind of sound effects and stuff, if you need hammers, whatever. Whatever the show is going to look like, it's better to try and squish it down to 1 or 2 pages of A4 so you can give it to somebody that you want to work with and they instantly understand what your idea is. And you can always go back to that sheet if you start going off track in what you want to make. An idea for your tone. Do you want to be irreverent? Do you want to be serious? Do you want to scream? Do you want to cry? Do you want to... I don't know. That's basically how you sound, what the rapport between you and your co-presenter, if you have one, is going to be. What is your podcast going to sound like? Commitment. There are so many podcasts out there, so many that get to episode 7 and stop in 2010. Especially the trans podcast, because I did my market research and there's maybe 5 trans podcasts on the planet that are still going, and maybe 30 that were just dead. So when you do this, if you're going to do an 8-episode run of a sort of audio play, are you going to be committed at episode 6 or 7? Try and figure out how much you can give to your project, realistically. You're going to need a microphone. Now, a microphone, you could get away with a microphone on your laptop or phone, straight out the box. People do that. There have been times where, when I've been roaming around, I've used just basically my headphones with the little crappy mic you get on the side, and that has worked. But if you can afford one, if you can afford to put a couple of quid in, you could get a $5 or a $10 microphone off Amazon, and that will boost up your sound quality so much. You need a recording device. 9 times out of 10, you could probably get away with doing it on your phone.
Which is what we do. Just putting that one out there, if you've listened to it. The recordings are done just on our phones through the tiny little microphones that we have and then edited together afterwards by the lovely and technically competent Michelle.
Yeah, you don't see what happens when I'm editing. It's usually a lot of me screaming at my iPad.
No, I can hear it from here. I mean, I know you're in London and everything, but that strange howling we occasionally hear in Manchester, that's Michelle trying to do the edit. So...
You also need a place to record, because I'm assuming that none of you have access to a studio with a full-on mixing board and super-duper XLR microphones, right? You can build a place to record in your house. I will go through how to do that. Do you need sound effects, music, stings? They are optional. People just release a podcast with just 2 people talking and there's no music in there. But
who'd do that, eh?
Hey, I built our theme tune.
You did.
I have no musical talent whatsoever, and I had no idea how to use GarageBand. It took me 10 hours to do 20 seconds of music.
I'm quite impressed, though. It was good.
Post-production equipment, that is probably going to be some software that you can download for free, or if you've got a few quid, you can throw a couple of quid at something. I'll go through those as well. You need to put your podcast on the listings on the podcast directories. These are not the same as where you will host the podcast. These are basically Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. There's loads of them. That's basically where people will listen to your podcast. And I didn't put it on the sheet, but you're also going to need somewhere to stick the actual audio file of your podcast, but I will go through that as well. Finally, promotion. I mean, you can do a podcast if nobody listens to it, because it is quite fun. We did the first few episodes and no one was listening, and that was still fun. But it's so much better when people listen. Because, people send you nice things on Twitter, or you show up in Manchester and you meet someone like Zane, who, for people at home, Zane works for the LGBT Foundation, and he sort of found me in the reception looking quite confused. And he was like, I listened to the show, and that was quite nice. Feel like I'm famous. But yeah, promotion, Ashley will go through all of that.
So, conscious of the fact this is a long list, right? There's a bunch of stuff to bear in mind with sort of putting together, with any given kind of creative-ish project. If you're sort of writing a book or whatever, you kind of tend to need to plan things ahead. So if you want to start a podcast, this is a damn good start of things to bear in mind, to plan ahead, to give consideration to one degree or another. It might be that you're quite far advanced on some of it. You might have a perfect idea of what your tone will be, of what your idea is, of what your focus is going to be, but you're here to develop a bit of technical acumen, or it could be the other way around. So we're going to break each of these things down in a little bit more detail before we get on to the workshop part of the day. So we're going to spend up until roughly about 25 past going through some of this stuff in a bit of detail. If you've got the capacity to make notes, great. But as we've mentioned, we will be making this entire presentation available through our podcast hosting, so you can download it. To start with, yes, so when you're actually creating your brief, there are things to consider. Is your very, very starting points. So there's a few things that would be expected from you if someone's reading a brief about your podcast, about like, well, we'll be able to do this because we have this, and we'll use this technology and these resources. But the initial idea is what you want to capture, essentially. Is your podcast going to be about yak acupuncture in Tibet during the 17th century? And to what extent are you going to need to research that, for example?
I want to hear that podcast.
No, you don't. Yak acupuncture is really boring. Look into the goat stuff. I am so sorry. But your initial idea, be that a research-based newsy type thing, or something fictional, or like a deliberately free-form artist collaborational type of thing. Are you going to develop role-play games and then play them on the podcast? You know, the options are astonishingly varied. But you have to consider what you're going to be bringing to it when you do that. So it's like, oh, well, I want to make a podcast about this thing that I know almost nothing about. Like, you're probably going to need to learn a few things beforehand. You might need to upskill in terms of, well, I need to be able to negotiate my way between the terminology and whatever else. But by the same token, you might not be so inspired to go and do a podcast about something that you don't know anything about. Chances are you might have an idea of a subject matter. Like, obviously with me and Michelle, if we were doing a podcast together, it was always going to center around the trans element, right? That's just going to happen because that's what we talk about.
Yeah, it made sense that we were going to go down the journalism news thing because of my background in journalism and Ashley's background in being an actual broadcaster.
But also consider, who is it for? Who's your audience? Is it other people like you? If so, great. How are you going to get it to them? To what way are you going to make an effort to engage people who are not directly the same as yourself? So who is your audience? Is it filling a need? Is it providing an information podcast? Is it here's how to cope with the DWP? Here's how to negotiate your way through the NHS medical system as a trans person. Is it going to be heavy information based? Is it going to be utilized by anybody for anything, for a particular reason? Questions like this, and getting to the point where you actually start planning out how you would do it. What's your format? How long is the podcast going to be per episode? How frequently is it released? What kind of points does it have in the middle of it? To help its sort of journey along, what's its format, essentially. But then other things that you're going to need to actually achieve this. It's like, okay, well, I can't do this on my own. I'm going to need to recruit some friends.
I just want to say you could totally do it on your own.
Oh, yeah, but...
but also get your mates involved, because it's pretty great.
It's good fun. Well,
go on.
I mean, you could certainly away a lot of people get started with podcasting. A lot of people get started with podcasting by starting it on their own and getting in their friends to talk about a particular subject. For example, a lot of things to think about, but a little bit later on, we are going to be asking you to create a brief. So these are the key things. We're going to come back to this when we're doing that little workshopy bit. We'll have these key points on the screen, so I'm not asking you to memorize all of these things. So on to, I guess, the meat of it. Like, what is your podcast going to consist of? Are you going to be doing something factual or something a bit more fictional? And how is that going to be, how are you going to bring that about, essentially? So if you want to do something that's factual, documentary-based, newsy, there are a couple of things to consider. Wrote up these pointers simply because this is kind of stuff that we have thought and noticed as we've gone along. So if you want to do something that's quite journalistic, newsy, please be thorough. Like there's, you can't just rely on one particular, this one blogger or this one newspaper says this and we're just going to kind of base ourselves off that the whole time. Don't do that. That's you then become a mouthpiece for something. And it might be a mouthpiece for something good, but it's not you expressing the full potential of the medium, essentially. So now different types of source, you might think, okay, well, all of what we're talking about or focusing on is, say, social media, in which case your main source is going to be social media. You're going to be spending time on Twitter and on Instagram and sort of see what other people are talking about and sharing around and so on, and obviously reacting to that to an extent. Again, a little bit more about this on the social media section. Depending on what your podcast is about, there might be some specialist stuff available. If you are making a sciencey podcast, there are things like National Geographic and New Scientist and various other things, these resources that are very, very specific, but might be useful to your endeavours. And then, likewise for your fictional stuff, and libraries. Always check out your local library. They've usually got a set of computers that you can access, as well as assistance in doing all sorts of various tasks, and signposting as well as all of the books, which are kind of worth the asking price. Just blitz through fictional and creative stuff, because this is not what we do. However, there's a couple of ideas that you might want to consider. What is it that you want to express with your kind of artistic leanings within the podcast? Are you working with anybody else? Do you plan to develop a play, like an audio play, as Michelle said, an 8-part audio play kind of thing over the season? Does that get written ahead of time, or is that kind of all workshopped with a cadre of actors? And if so, where are you going to recruit your actors, and how are you going to find time to talk to each other and rehearse? Things like, now there are a lot of communication tools out there as well. Things like Discord are actually very, very useful for large group discussions, and you can then have a full read through of a fictional podcast with people who are literally all over the world. So, but bear in mind, time zones are a thing, so that can be a bit of a, and again, libraries. Talked about tone, precisely what you're expressing, how is that going to be done? Are you going to be sarcastic? Are you going to be very, very dry? Are you going to be very straight ahead and neutral and BBC-ish? Although, don't do that. Because honestly, that comes with its own problems, as we have observed with a lot of coverage recently. So,
plus, they're really dull.
Yeah, really boring.
You've read the BBC News website. It's just so dull. Mm. Like, say what you want about the Daily Mail. The stakes are always high. It's always the world is always about to end.
Yes, because of coffee or something and everything. And its amazing quest that it's got going to categorize every single thing in the universe into something that either causes or cures cancer. And coffee is on both lists. So what do you want, really? So back slightly to the workshop elements. So your tone does cover stuff like, to what extent do you use emotion in what you're talking about? To what extent are you using whimsical flights of fancy? But it can also influence things like what background music that you're using. If you're doing a podcast about Manchester's hardcore punk scene, then backing up and having a theme tune in the vein of Enya is probably not... It's going to be a bit of a change in tone. A little bit too much.
But if you make that podcast, I love pop hardcore. Like, if you make that podcast, you tweet me. You tweet me.
Oh yeah, I love hardcore punk new age music. Totally here for it.
Tweet us. We want to know.
But then other considerations for your tone are around language. You're a person who uses swearing. Is swearing acceptable for you? Obviously, we've got no fucking problem with it. But some podcaster, almost all of the podcast directors will ask you to declare the fact so they can label it as explicit. And
absolutely do that on Apple. They don't do a strike system or anything. Apple are weirdly strict about so many things, and I'll go into that in my little bit.
Yeah. In terms of your tone and your language, this is a good point to consider. Where are your red lines? What do you absolutely not want to do, either inadvertently or deliberately? And, how do you avoid those mistakes? How do you avoid upholding structural and institutional racism? If you're podcasting as a white person, for example, you have to kind of, checks and balances, again, depending on the type of material you're producing. And as Michelle mentioned earlier on, so the commitment element is quite important. We've said that we'll do something every 2 weeks, and even then sometimes it's a bit variable. The podcast is occasionally late because one or both of us is busy or having some problems, essentially. And
yeah, I'm quite mad. If anybody listened to the podcast a couple of weeks back, I did a whole episode about how mad I am. And yeah, it's that is something you should take into account when you're making a podcast. If you've got mental health issues, much like myself, take that into account with try to work out how much emotional labour it's going to take and if you can do it. I could just about do it with what we're doing now, but if we were doing this every week, it would not work. It's
too much, isn't it? And particularly because what we're doing is dealing with all the really depressing, hateful stuff that is specifically levelled at trans people. It affects both of us. It does. It's just really grim. I had to take a little break of it just after Christmas because I just couldn't hack doing it.
Yeah, I basically had to do like 2 or 3 episodes where I was just shouting up my bedroom wall.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. I did suggest you should take a break over Christmas, but you didn't. I don't think you quite heard that in the suggestion, but
I don't know. I'm in a rhythm. Yeah. I'm going to keep doing a podcast every 2 weeks until after I'm dead.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good ambition. Just so yeah, but in terms of just bringing it back to the workshop once again, after digressing once again, I'm really sorry. So yes, it's about, do you have the commitment to meet that? To what extent is the emotional labour going to be problematic? And to what extent is that true for the people that you're collaborating with?
All right, let's talk about equipment. This is my domain, because I am a huge nerd. There are 2 things you absolutely have to have. These are the bare minimum of your recording setup. You must have a computer or a tablet. You won't be able to upload your podcast to your particular hosting service from your PlayStation. You won't be able to do it from your Alexa-powered fridge. You absolutely have to have a tablet or preferably a laptop or PC. I say preferably because basically everything you hear on our podcast is created entirely on this iPad in front of me. Which is very good because I have edited episodes in the bath.
Weird. For me, that is weird. I'm sorry. It's like, how's the
it's like getting
it's great.
It's like getting a hug from the earth.
I don't know. I'm experiencing complicated emotions about this now. Let's carry on before they make themselves felt.
But yes, you absolutely have to have that as sort of your base because you can record onto it, you can edit on it. You can upload on it, you can run your social medias on it, you can basically run an entire podcasting empire from whatever computer or tablet you have. If you could even do it on just your phone, but it's quite fiddly. I have edited episodes on my phone whilst on trains and stuff, and you can do it, but my thumbs are quite big, and Get a laptop. You must have the use of a reliable internet connection. This is paramount, for research purposes, obviously, but also because you need to upload the thing. You can't put it on tape and send it over the post. You absolutely have to upload it directly. Now, you're probably worrying about I haven't got, I may need the most perfect equipment. This stuff doesn't sound right. Poppycock and balderdash. Scarcity is the mother of invention. Talent is honed through lack. Use what you have to hand. Chances are you have some recording equipment in the form of your phone or an old laptop, or one of your friends has an old tablet from 2013 that barely works. You could totally use that. Just grab what you can. Don't worry about spending hundreds of pounds you don't have on a Blue Yeti microphone or any of that stuff. Use what you have when you're starting out, because if you don't like it, you haven't invested loads of money and have these objects to just signify your failure all around your house. But I would say if you have some cash to spare, getting a microphone is a good move. The microphones are usually, when they come with a laptop, they're usually used for talking to your grandma who lives in Thailand. It's not going to sound as good as it could be. A microphone that you buy doesn't have to be a lot of money. Our microphone is basically the size of a large postage stamp. It plugs into our phones. That's what you are listening to right now, people at home, and the people in the room can see. It's this little thing here. That was 30 quid, and it jumped the quality of our recordings up about 3 times. It sounded 3 times better.
It made a significant difference, and it is super easy to use. Just go straight into the phone's headphone jack. And for when I'm recording my section of the podcast on my Android phone, because yours is Apple, just use the standard voice recorder with that microphone. No problem at all. It's perfectly crisp, and it's never been a problem. So
yeah. You will also need some kind of audio recording, processing, and editing software. Now, this stuff is available for free. There are plenty of open source solutions for this. Like, if you own an Apple device, you get a lot of this stuff for free. Like, you can use GarageBand to do it. I wouldn't recommend it, because GarageBand is made entirely for music, and it measures things in musical bars. We do not speak in musical bars, so it's quite hard to work out exactly how long the podcast is going to be. That was one of my first experiments from trying to set this up, so I plumbed up for an app. But yeah, there are some really good free options out there. Audacity on Windows, that is a wonderful piece of software you can download for free right now. You can do all of those things on there. You can record, process, and edit your sound to make it sound awesome through that. And it's completely free. OSEN Audio, it's supposed to be spelled like that. I don't know why. Tech people always spell their things weird. I don't understand. That is like the Audacity equivalent for Mac. I've never used it because I don't have a Mac computer or any kind of computer really. But that, I've done some reading around, and that is a good alternative for Audacity on your Mac if you have one. There are low-priced mobile options. There's Audio Evolution Mobile Studio, which I have used years ago, and that is pretty good. And there's also Ferrite Recording Studio on iOS, which is what I use. And I can recommend that. It's got a free, you can download it for free, and you can edit somewhat. And if you like it, there is a £20 upgrade you can get, which basically unlocks all these wonderful things. Like, it automatically cuts out silencers. I'll go into why that's important in a bit. It can do auto processing. It's just a wonderful piece of software that I would thoroughly recommend if you have an Apple device. If you don't have it, Audio Evolution Mobile Studio is just as good, but you have to pay for that, unfortunately. But they're quite cheap. They're like a tenner compared to the hundreds of pounds you could be spending on a laptop or a PC or something like that. They're a bargain. And also, you can edit in the bath. Building a studio. I record my end of the podcast in my tiny bedroom in a London flat. And if any of you know anything about London flats are tiny and awful. People have probably been murdered in my flat, but not with much room because it's very small. But you can totally make a studio anywhere. So yeah, you can set up a studio in your house with relative ease. Find a quiet-ish corner of your home. A corner's good because, it's a corner. It's very, very hard for sound to bounce off towards you. It's sound science. It makes sense, I think. Use sound absorbers. Blankets, egg cartons. I use soft toys because my mum was throwing out all of my childhood toys, so I was like, nah, that's not happening. Took a bin bag full of soft toys back to my place, and I made a little wall in a little nook in my corner of my room that absorbs outside sound, so you only record me. I know people who have recorded their podcast under a blanket. They just put a blanket over them, and that blocks out a lot more sound than you would think. But it's quite warm. Take a bottle of water. You don't want to die. Keep your audio equipment on a flat and stable surface, because if you are recording on your bed, which is a perfectly viable option, as long as you put a plank of wood over it or something. But if you have it just bouncing on your bed every time you move, the microphone will move, and that will cause unwanted sounds. Also, you're probably going to be recording with a glass of water. Try and keep the glass of water on a different surface away from the microphone and keep it on the floor. Or keep it on the floor because, that's now on the recording forever. And I'll have to edit it out. But yeah, Do not record at these locations unless it's part of your show. Do not record outside unless you absolutely have to make your show. Do not record in a zoo because it smells of poop and it's terrible. Zoos shouldn't exist. Do not do it on the toilet because that's just weird. The bath is acceptable. The toilet is not. And do not do it in space, not for any other reason, because it is quiet in space, but space will kill you. It's a nightmare. Have you seen that movie Gravity? It's awful up there. Don't go into space.
Well, I don't know, just the thing though with Speed 2 and Gravity and Bird Box, I just don't want to go anywhere with Sandra Bullock. Right? Like, she just seems to attract trouble, seemingly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just like, you stay away from her. Like, hey, Ashley, do you want to go? No. No, I want to stay in a nice locked room wherever you're not. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
That's all good.
Slight tangent.
So yeah, sound effects, music and all of that. Do not use copyrighted material, ever. You will be taken to court and beaten with sticks. These people with lots of money do not like it when people use their stuff, even if, it does no harm, which it will not do any harm if you did, but they will kill you dead.
But there's a couple of little things around this, particularly regarding fair use. Now, we could have done an entire 2-hour workshop simply on the differences and whatever of fair use.
Yeah.
If you are going to look into using different bits of sound and music within your podcast, that is something that I would definitely recommend you acquaint yourself with. There are a couple of how-to sort of easy guides to it, but we just don't have time to cover that in a tremendous amount of depth on this.
There is one. Basically, if you are commenting or satirizing, then you can include copyrighted material. But that is very, very loose, and a company who owns the rights to Superman or whatever has a lot more lawyers than you. And I'm guessing if you are in this room, you haven't got thousands of pounds to spare on a whole bunch of lawyers and solicitors. So err on the side of caution. But there are places you can go to get free sound effects, which I've used. First off, make your own. If you need a sound effect of a bunch of coins hitting a table, just get a bunch of coins and throw them at a table. Freesounds.org is really good. You basically got loads of people who make the sound effects in their house, and they just upload them, and you don't even need to attribute to them half the time. They're there for the community. People are good. Audio Blocks, they've got a premium service which is quite pricey, but you can download the stuff for free as long as you attribute the original creator of the sound. You just put that in the description of the podcast when you're uploading. That'll sort it out. You can get royalty-free music. Again, make your own. I made our music. I'm going to say this all again.
Yes.
It took me 10 hours. I have never used GarageBand before. You can use GarageBand that comes with every iOS device. Also, there are alternatives to Windows that I will go through in a bit. Oh yeah, Limbs. Limbs is like the open source Windows version of GarageBand, which is just as good. Not as pretty, because, it's made by amateurs, but it's just as good. You can totally make your own music, and it's just dragging and dropping stings. Like little audio clips into a song. That's all it is. It's quite straightforward, because I did it. It took me 10 hours, but I did it.
Yes.
And you're the musician.
I know, right?
Okay. Do not use music from popular musicians without their permission, because they will kill you dead. Do not use clips from popular movies and TV, because they will kill you dead.
And then persecute you in court.
Yes. You could maybe use small clips from interviews in other places, but you would have to definitely reference where you got it from, and that could be dodgy. But you could probably get away with it from newspapers and stuff on YouTube. Because you can get small clips from YouTube because they have been sort of uploaded and there are original copyright holders, but if it's someone's vlog and they make a good point, you could probably take a small clip from them. I mean, ask permission if you can, but they're probably not going to come after you, and you're not exactly stealing from them because if you give them credit, you're driving traffic towards them, so everybody wins. You can get small bands. Small, tiny bands. If you're in a band, get your band to do with the music. If you know somebody who's in a band, get them to do it. Work out some kind of deal that if you ever get sponsorship, which is... If you're starting out, you're a long way from that anyway, but if you eventually do, you can give them a cut. You can give them a quid or something. Well, more than £1. I don't know. That's your thing. You have to consult lawyers for that kind of thing. We're not there yet. Sound is measured Sound is measured in decibels, and it usually goes from a range of -60 to 0. I do not know why it's minus, but 0-60 is basically very close to silence. 0 is very loud. You want to try and record, so the loudest thing you are recording is -3. Because if it goes over 0, it starts to sound like this, and it's not very good. Too low is better than too high. If you record too high, it distorts, you can't fix it. If you record too low, you can boost it up, and it'll sound alright. So aim for lower than higher when you're recording. But most of the apps these days will auto-regulate when you record, so you probably won't have to worry about that, but with your more basic stuff you will. Record the purest audio that you absolutely can. That goes without saying. Try and have as little between you and the recording device as possible. For example, don't record over the internet. There are some services where you can, but try to avoid that whenever you can. And if you want to bring in guests from further afield, because the good thing about podcasting is you can have guests from all over the world coming to talk to you. Like me and Ashley, we're not in the same room. Ashley records on her end, I record on my end, and I splice them together. That's the beautiful thing about podcasts. You can talk to anyone in the world, and you can make it kind of sound like you're in the same room. Now, there is a service called Zencastr. They have a free option where you log in and it will record all the people talking to each other. You can't really do that on Skype or Audacity or a program like that. I mean, there are programs out there where you can, but Zencastr is custom made and they have a free option that's very good. You can also up and pay them if you want to get like 5 or 6 people in. It's like 20 quid a month. Yeah, it's like 20 quid a month, and they're a really good service. I'd recommend. In post-production, edit down your audio. This is mandatory. You absolutely must edit, because otherwise you get things like that silence, and that doesn't sound very good. Silence is powerful. Use it sparingly. If you need, you can put in a second or two to make a point more emphatic, but try and avoid making too much silence because, you want to engage the listener. Use noise reduction. Noise reduction it comes under a couple of names, but basically it's what I did at the beginning of this recording when I asked everyone to be quiet for 10 seconds. Basically that is a baseline of background sounds in the room. And what I will do is I will tell my editing software, this is the 10 seconds, I want you to learn this, and then it will learn it, and then you say apply, and it will get rid of that background sound from the whole thing. It's magic. I don't know how it works, but pretty much every audio processing and editing software I've mentioned today has this option. Use it. It will make your stuff sound like you're in an actual professional studio and not under a blanket in your bath. When outputting, lower the bitrate to maximize hosting space. I'm not going to get into too much detail about what a bitrate is. Basically, it's how much stuff is in your file. The more stuff is in your file, the larger your file is. When me and Ashley were first doing it, we had files that were about 1 or 2 gigabytes. 1,000 megabytes, which is a lot, and it's too much. Now we basically got it down to 50 megabytes per episode, which is a lot less, and with hosting companies, you only get a certain amount of space to upload every month. Like we were on a plan where we had 250 megabytes to play with, so we really needed to get that down a lot. So, and the difference in headphones on a train, it makes no difference. It's still going to sound good. So, find the bitrate setting in whatever you're doing and lower it. Hosting a podcast directories, there are loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of professional podcast hosting people. Podbean is probably the most famous. They've got plans starting at $3 to $99. They're all American, so they're all in dollars. That's about £2 to £80 per month. Libsyn, which is what we use, we are on a $15, so like a £12 thing. We get 250 megabytes a month, and they basically, the Podbean and Libsyn do wonderful thing. Well, they will automatically push your podcast onto all the directories for you, which will save you so much time. They are both amazing services. You could do worse. Now, if you have no money, Buzzsprout is an option. You get a free 2 hours every month, but they're not great, but that's what you get for free. So you can upload 2 hours per month for free. And YouTube. The problem with YouTube is that you can totally upload and you will get listeners, but they're never going to appear on someone's podcast app. But if you're looking for a way to start and you've got no money, you could start there. People just publish to YouTube on its own, and it totally works. There's a service out there called Anchor. They are garbage. Do not use them. They are free and offer all sorts of wonderful bells and whistles, but then they take the rights to your podcast away from you. And I couldn't work out whether that was forever or just as long as you use their service. But do not use Anchor. They try to lure you in by offering you all the wonderful stuff for free. They are the Facebook of podcast hosting. They are evil. Do not go there. And do not use SoundCloud, because we did for the first couple of weeks and it was awful. And you don't know if SoundCloud's going to financially collapse any second. They've been on the verge of bankruptcy for like 3 years now. They have a podcasting platform, but it's awful. It's genuinely terrible. Don't use SoundCloud. Now, the directories are different from the hosting companies, because basically the directories, there are these things called RSS feeds. They have been on the internet for as long as forever. They were on the internet back in the weird days of the internet, where it was all like nappy fetish websites and coin collecting websites and all the weirdness that goes in between.
Which bits of the internet were you on back then?
What can I say? Like, you go on Alta Vista long enough, you're going to see some shit. You're going to see some shit.
Anyway, carry on. Directories.
Some of the people in here won't even know what Alta Vista is.
You're a sweet summer child.
So basically, an RSS feed is something that people would subscribe to, and they will get, in the old days, articles that would just appear on their computer. Now, RSS feeds are almost entirely used for podcasts, and the hosting companies will basically make an RSS feed, and the directories host all the RSS feeds so people can go through them and subscribe to the feed and get your podcast. Does that make sense? Now, these are the big ones that will probably get you on pretty much every app in the world. You've got Apple Podcasts, which is the big one. You go through iTunes Connect. They are the strictest. If you are going to be explicit, tick the explicit box, or they will kick you off. And also, I'll get into that in a bit. There's Spotify, which is basically, over the last couple of months, has really, really come up. It's basically a third of our listeners now come from Spotify. Stitcher, that's really huge in America. TuneIn, maybe 1% of your listeners will come through that. It's not particularly great, but you might as well. It's free to go on there. Spreaker, that's supposed to be Spreaker, but my autocorrect changed it to Speaker. It's actually Spreaker because nobody can spell in Techland. Digital Podcast and Blueberry, again, no E's. Technology companies don't like E's in their names. But yeah, you basically just go on all these websites, just search on the website, submit podcast, you just give them the feed address that you'll be provided by your hosting companies. But again, Podbean and Libsyn will do that all for you. So if you've got the cash, I'd thoroughly recommend going one of them. And that's the end of the technical bit. Did that make sense to everyone?
It's all more or less so, kid. There is a lot of stuff. Yeah. Just a bit about how you want. Okay, so you've done your podcast and you've recorded it and you've edited it and you've put your music and your sound in it, and then you've chosen your hosting and where you're going to advertise it and stuff. But what does it look like? What else are you going to do to actually promote the podcast? And obviously, one of the main ways that people choose to promote things in this day and age is, of course, your social media. So there are a few different considerations when it comes to branding and stuff. Does it have artwork? Are you going to have a Facebook page or a Twitter page or whatever with a main image on it? Who's going to produce that image? Is it going to be based on something that you already did? Are you just going to sketch it out? It's all good, but when you're doing that, I guess try and be consistent with your art style. If you've got dozens of different ways of writing the logo, there's no point having any of them because no one's going to recognize the consistency of it being the same basic podcast. And as I said, so who's responsible for it? So different social media platforms tend to be quite good for sharing different kinds of content / sharing it in a slightly different sort of a way. So Twitter, obviously, it's very, very short posts, micro-blogging site. You can chain these things together to create a nice trail of, we talked about da-da-da in the podcast, more information here. Or here's the article that we mentioned from The Advocate, da-da-da-da-da, and links to it. And so it's very, very good for, keeping on top of what's going on, kind of in Trans Town. Well, in most towns, really. I
want to go to Trans Town.
Yeah, I think you're here, darling. But there are pitfalls to social media as well. Of course, Twitter can be absolutely great for getting a message out, for reaching a whole new audience using hashtags and so on. But it is also full of Nazis and Terfs. So don't ever be afraid to hit the block button, Because if somebody is coming at you in bad faith or insulting, you don't owe them anything. You don't owe them your emotional labor. You don't owe them an explanation for why you are whatever. Just block. Bye-bye. Done. Not interested.
Blocklist.
Yeah. Blockchain, Terf blocker.
Yeah.
That's the one that we use. So
thoroughly recommend Terf blocker. That will basically, there's somebody out
whether
there.
you're podcasting or not, actually would recommend Terf blocker.
Because someone out there keeps a little database of all of the bad people, and then you subscribe to it and it automatically blocks all the bad people. Twitter is now usable for us because of Terf blocker. Thoroughly recommend.
Absolutely. So Instagram. Now, if you're doing a podcast, it may or may not have visual elements, but Instagram is obviously a very heavily picture and image focused thing. So that's quite a good way of setting yourself up with an aesthetic and doing kind of research. But obviously that is going to be influenced by what type of podcast you're doing. If you're doing a podcast about gothic fiction, chances are you're not going to illustrate it with pictures of pink glittery fairies. For example, so again, consistency and the type of content that you will share on there, again, using hashtags to sort of spread it around, does depend on what exactly your podcast is and consists of. Tumblr, reasonably easy to use and slightly more influential than a lot of people give it credit for. Obviously, we did see recently that they struck off a lot of the explicit content on their site. Again, still full of Nazis, but then that's the Americans for you. But a lot of people do use it. And again, lots of different types of content and different lengths of post can be hosted there, as well as different videos, audio files, whatever. It's just it seems quite multi-purpose and it is well used. So, it's worth familiarizing yourself with, even if just as a kind of a basic blog that you can have in accompaniment to your podcast. And obviously Facebook, it's ubiquitous all over the place. Everybody uses it, but posts from your particular page or things that you're trying to promote can often just be lost in the noise or defeated by Facebook's glorious algorithms. All hail Zuckerberg. So yes, that is Ashley and Michelle's very, very quick wordy guide to starting a podcast and things that are worth thinking about.
All right, that wraps everything up from us. Thank you very much for coming. This was What the Trans Live with us. Yay! Thank you. Ashley, we were rock stars for a bit.
We were totally rock stars, yes. Yeah, no, it was good. That was a good experience, wasn't it? And like what I like about podcasting and kind of the reason we're doing this is because it is quite straightforward and you can get started with a fairly minimal amount of tech. And it's so, let's just democratize everything, including all of the information. So yeah, do a podcast. If you want to do a trans news podcast, awesome. We'll give you some pointers.
Yeah, like if you need any help setting up your own podcast, just hit us up on What the Trans on Twitter or What the Trans on Facebook. Or you can get us on our new website on Tumblr, and you can even send us a message anonymously on there. That's whatthetranspod.tumblr.com.
Woo.
So yeah, hit us up. If you already do a trans news podcast and you're annoyed that we keep saying we're the only one, do let us know, and we will immediately stop.
Yes, and we will listen, and there will be sharing and solidarity and all of that good stuff, because that's how we win, right?
Yeah, totally come on our podcast. All right, so I think that's the show done. Is that the show done?
That's the show done. Excellent work. Jolly good.
Yes, let's all sit around and congratulate each other. We did a good show.
Oh yes, jolly good. Good shit. No, seriously, thanks for tuning in. If you're listening to this, and if you're not listening to this, I guess how I express the question to you has just become a metaphysical quandary, because if you're not listening to this, how did you just hear me? Anyway.
Oh God, my brain hurts. Stop being metaphysical.
Anyway, so yes, thanks for listening. Do check us out on all of the social media channels, and we shall return in 2 weeks.
Alright, thanks guys. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.